The late summer sun of 1888 beat down on the high plains valley, baking the dust and bleaching the wild grasses to a pale gold. In the new settlement of Providence, the air was thick with the scent of raw pine and the rhythmic clang of hammers against iron nails. Men, stripped to their shirt sleeves, worked with a hurried intensity, their faces grim with the knowledge of the coming cold. Every cabin being raised was a testament to tradition and haste, for straight walls, a simple pitched roof, a square footprint set firmly against the earth. They were sturdy, predictable, and fast to build. It was the only way they knew. Amidst this flurry of right angles and frantic labor, a different shape was taking form on a small plot at the edge of the settlement. Anneliese worked alone, save for the great German shepherd that lay in the shade of a lone cottonwood, his dark eyes following her every move. Her foundation was not a square. It was a perfect, eight-sided figure marked out with string and stakes, a geometric anomaly in the landscape of squares. The other settlers paused in their work, leaning on their hammers to watch her. They saw a widow, a woman whose husband had succumbed to fever on the journey west, now toiling under the same sun as they were, but with a strange and unsettling purpose. Mr. Abram, a man whose authority came from the sheer volume of his voice, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "What in heaven's name is she building?" he muttered to the man beside him. "Looks like she's trying to build a beehive." Laughter followed, rough and dismissive. They saw wasted effort, a foolish design that would surely prove difficult and weak. Anneliese heard them, but her movements never faltered. Her husband, a man of books and diagrams, had spent their last winter together sketching this very design, explaining its logic with a quiet, confident passion. It was his legacy to her, a promise of shelter. She lifted another heavy foundation stone into place, her hands raw, her back aching. Kaiser, the dog, lifted his head and let out a low, soft growl, not of aggression, but of warning, a sound that told the watching men to keep their distance. She patted his head as she passed, her touch a silent thank you. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, and still she worked, laying the foundation of her strange, eight-sided home. As the days shortened and a crisp edge began to creep into the morning air, the walls of the cabins in Providence rose higher. The settlement looked like a grid of wooden boxes, each one a mirror of the next. On her plot, Anneliese's octagonal structure began to take shape, its angled walls creating a form that seemed almost organic against the rigid lines of the other homes. The initial whispers of curiosity from her neighbors had now soured into open ridicule. The men, emboldened by their progress, would often wander over on their way to the creek, offering advice that was thinly veiled mockery. "You'll have a hard time getting a roof on that thing," Mr. Davies called out one afternoon, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. "A proper house has 4 corners." "It's how it's always been done." Anneliese simply nodded, continuing to measure a length of timber with meticulous care. "The Lord gave us 4 seasons and 4 winds. A house ought to have 4 corners to meet them," another man added, earning a chuckle from his fellows. She ignored the flawed theology. Her husband had taught her that the wind was a river, and it was wiser to build a smooth stone that lets the current flow around it than a jagged rock that takes the full force of the water. The women were no kinder, though their criticism was quieter, shared over laundry lines and water buckets. "A woman alone," one would whisper. She ought to have accepted help, let the men build her a proper cabin. They saw her independence as folly, her unique design as a sign of a mind unsettled by grief. Anneliese saw only the diagrams burned into her memory, the logic of angles and surfaces. Kaiser remained her steadfast companion, a silent shadow that padded along the perimeter of her worksite. He never barked at the curious onlookers, but his presence was a clear boundary. He would sit, patient and watchful, as she planed a board or notched a log, his loyalty an unspoken rebuttal to the community's doubt. She worked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, her focus absolute. While others rushed, she took her time, ensuring every joint was perfect, every angle precise. Her pace was not born of weakness, but of a deep, abiding patience. She wasn't just building a house, she was honoring a promise. The framing of the roofs became the settlement's next great undertaking. On the square cabins, the work was straightforward, long rafters meeting at a central ridge beam, a task performed with practiced efficiency. On Anneliese's Octagon, However, the roofing was a complex convergence of 8 triangular sections, a puzzle of interlocking beams that baffled the onlookers. The laughter grew louder, more confident. Mr. Abram declared it a fool's errand to anyone who would listen. "She'll never get it sealed," he pronounced, gesturing with a half-eaten apple. "First rain, she'll be swimming in her own living space. Mark my words, that thing will leak like a sieve." The men working on their own roofs would shout down jokes, their words carrying easily on the autumn wind. "Better start building an ark in there," one called, followed by a chorus of guffaws. But one man did not laugh. Owen, a younger carpenter who had come west to make his name, would often watch her from the half-finished frame of the Miller family's cabin. He saw no foolishness in her work. He saw precision. He watched how she used a plumb bob and a level not as mere tools, but as extensions of her own senses. He saw the intricate cuts she made, the way each short rafter fit perfectly against the central hub. He saw a design that distributed weight evenly, a structure of inherent strength. He saw intelligence where others saw madness. He never spoke to her, intimidated by the wall of public opinion and her own quiet reserve, but he watched, and he learned. Annalise, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny, worked on. She climbed her ladder with a steady grace, her movements economical and sure. The roof, which the others had predicted would be her downfall, came together piece by piece, a marvel of geometry. As she nailed the final board into place, a sudden gust of wind swept down from the mountains, colder than any that had come before. It rattled the loose boards on the other cabins and carried the scent of snow. The laughter in the valley died down, replaced by a new urgency. Winter was no longer a distant threat, its breath was on their necks. The first snow came not as a blizzard, but as a gentle, persistent dusting that coated the valley in a thin blanket of white. It was a beautiful sight, but for the settlers of Providence, it was a final, chilling warning. A frantic energy seized the community. The air filled with the sounds of men chopping wood at a feverish pace, their axes ringing out in the cold, still air. Women and children worked to chink the gaps in their log walls with a mixture of mud, moss, and grass, their fingers numb from the cold. The square corners of their cabins, so quick to build, now proved to be their greatest weakness. They were difficult to seal, and every small gap was an open invitation to the wind. While her neighbors scrambled, Annalise worked with the same calm deliberation as before. Her cabin was already sealed. The angles of the octagon had allowed for tighter, more secure joinery. Now, she moved inside, installing the small iron stove that would be her only source of heat. She carefully fitted the stovepipe through the roof, sealing it with a collar of tin and tar, leaving no path for the cold to enter. Owen watched her from a distance. He saw that her woodpile, while substantial, was only half the size of Mr. Abrams, yet she gathered wood with no sense of panic. She moved about her tasks with an unhurried grace, her dog trotting calmly at her heels. The mockery from the other settlers had all but ceased, replaced by a tense silence. They were too consumed by their own desperate preparations to spare any ridicule for her. Still, they watched her. They saw her through the swirling flurries, a solitary figure moving with a quiet confidence that was deeply unsettling. Her strange, 8-sided house no longer looked foolish. In the soft, fading light of the snow-filled afternoon, it began to look formidable, like a fortress built not of aggression, but of wisdom. The snow continued to fall, and as darkness enveloped the valley, the yellow lights of lanterns began to appear in the windows of the square cabins. But from Annalise's octagonal home, there was only a steady, thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a calm and measured breath against the coming night. The cold did not relent. It seeped into the valley and took root, hardening the ground and freezing the creek at its edges. A fierce wind rose from the north, a relentless, scouring force that howled across the plains. For the settlers in their square cabins, the wind was a physical assault. It slammed into their broad, flat walls, shaking the very foundations. The men had built their homes to face the elements head-on, a battle of brute strength. The wind found every imperfection, every tiny crack in the chinking. It whistled through the corners, a mournful, chilling sound that spoke of the immense, indifferent power of the wilderness. Inside, families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They stuffed rags into the gaps around window frames and doorways, but the drafts were persistent, ghostly fingers of cold that snaked across the floor. The iron stoves roared, consuming firewood at an alarming rate, yet the warmth they produced was quickly stolen by the cold. The corners of the rooms remained frigid, dead spaces where the heat could not reach. In Annalise's cabin, the story was different. The wind, encountering no flat surface to attack, flowed around the 8-angled walls. The house did not shudder or groan, it stood firm, parting the current of air like a ship's prow. Inside, there was a profound and enveloping quiet, the roar of the storm muted to a distant whisper. Her small stove burned with a steady, controlled flame, its heat radiating outwards in a gentle, even circle. There were no cold corners in the Octagon. The warmth circulated freely, creating a consistent and comfortable temperature throughout the single, open room. Kaiser, the dog, was not huddled by the fire. He lay stretched out on a hand-woven rug near the door, his sleep deep and untroubled. Annalise sat in a simple wooden chair, mending a tear in a canvas sack. The lantern light cast a warm, golden glow on the smooth plank walls. There was no battle here. There was only shelter. Peace. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside the strange cabin the settlers had mocked, there was only the quiet hum of a home at peace with the winter. The storm intensified, burying the valley in a world of white. For 3 days, the snow fell without pause, driven by a wind that never seemed to tire. The settlement of Providence vanished, its cabins reduced to snow-covered mounds with smoking chimneys. Travel between homes became a treacherous, exhausting ordeal. The world shrank to the 4 walls of each family's shelter. Inside those walls, desperation began to set in. The immense piles of firewood, which had seemed more than adequate just weeks before, were dwindling with terrifying speed. The constant battle against the cold required the stoves to be fed day and night. Mr. Davies, his face etched with worry, watched his wife, Martha, shiver under a pile of blankets, her breathing shallow and ragged. Their youngest son coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the drafty cabin. "We're burning through the wood twice as fast as I figured," he said, his voice low and strained. "The cold, it just finds every crack in these walls." Mr. Abram, in the cabin next door, faced the same struggle. He was a proud man, not given to admitting weakness, but fear was beginning to gnaw at him. He stood by his window, peering through a small patch he had scraped clear of frost, and watched the smoke rising from the chimneys. Most, like his own, belched thick, dark plumes, the sign of a fire burning hot and fast, a desperate attempt to generate heat. But one chimney was different. Annalise's. From her stovepipe rose a thin, almost lazy ribbon of pale grey smoke. It was the sign of a slow, efficient burn. It was the smoke of a fire that was not fighting a losing war, but gently holding the cold at bay. He watched that steady plume for a long time, the sight of it a silent, maddening rebuke to his own certainty. He had mocked her design, her patience, her strange logic. Now, as his own family shivered and his woodpile shrank, he was forced to confront the chilling possibility that she had been right all along. The wind howled, and the snow piled deeper, and in the heart of the storm, a seed of doubt, planted months ago, began to finally, painfully, take root in the frozen ground of his pride. When the snow finally stopped, a new kind of cold descended. The sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature plummeted. The air itself seemed to turn to ice, sharp and brittle in the lungs. It was a dry, silent, killing cold. For the Davies family, the crisis had reached its peak. Their woodpile was gone, reduced to a few splinters and a pile of bark. The fire in their stove had died hours ago, and the cabin's interior was now only marginally warmer than the air outside. Martha's fever had worsened, and their son's cough had taken on a dangerous, rattling edge. Mr. Davies knew he had to do something. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around his face, his breath instantly freezing on the wool. "I'll be back," he promised, his words muffled and grim. He opened the door and was met by a wall of deep, powdery snow. The journey to his nearest neighbor, Mr. Abram, would have been a few dozen steps in the summer. Now, it was a brutal struggle through waist-deep drifts in air that burned his skin. He pushed onward, his legs screaming with effort, his destination not Abram's house, but the strange, eight-sided cabin on the edge of the settlement. He had laughed at her. He had called her a fool. Now, the memory of that thin, steady plume of smoke was his only hope. He stumbled through the snow, the silence of the frozen landscape broken only by his own ragged breathing. Finally, he reached her door, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. He raised a numb hand and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. For a moment, there was no answer, and a terrible despair seized him. Then, he heard the soft scrape of a bolt being drawn. The door swung inward. Annalise stood there, her dog at her side, his posture alert but not aggressive. And from the open doorway, a wave of warmth washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, steady, life-giving warmth. He stared past her into the calm, quiet interior, and in that moment, all his mockery, all his certainty, turned to ash. Mr. Davies stumbled across the threshold, his body overwhelmed by the sudden transition from the brutal cold to the enveloping warmth. He stood there, speechless, as Annalise closed the door, sealing out the frozen world. The silence inside was profound. There were no whistling drafts, no groaning timbers, only the soft, rhythmic crackle of the fire in the small stove. The air was warm and still. He pulled the frozen scarf from his face, his eyes taking in the space. The single octagonal room felt larger than his own square cabin, more open. The lantern light reflected off the pale wood walls, creating a soft, welcoming glow. Kaiser, the dog, watched him with intelligent eyes before settling back onto the rug, apparently satisfied that the visitor posed no threat. My family," Davies stammered, his words thick with emotion and cold. "The wood is gone. My wife, my boy, they're sick." The cold, he didn't need to finish. Annalise simply nodded, her expression one of quiet empathy, not pity or triumph. She gestured for him to sit near the stove and ladled a steaming broth into a mug, pressing it into his trembling hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a feeling so profound it was almost painful. He drank, the hot liquid a balm to his frozen insides. He looked around the room, truly seeing it for the first time. He noticed how the furniture was arranged in the open space, how there were no dark, unused corners. The heat from the stove seemed to reach every part of the room equally. "How," he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How is it so warm in here?" "Our cabin, it feels like the wind blows right through it." Annalise looked at the stove, its small fire burning with an almost lazy efficiency. "My husband was a student of design," she said, her voice calm and even. "He believed a house should not fight the wind. A square corner catches the wind and creates pressure. It tries to tear the wall down. But an angle divides the wind. It lets it flow past." She pointed to the ceiling, where the 8 rafters met in the center. "The roof supports itself. It is stronger, and it sheds the snow more evenly. We built for the winter we knew was coming, not for the summer we were in." Her explanation was simple, practical, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't magic. It was logic. A logic they had all been too proud and too hurried to see. The news of the warmth in Annalise's cabin spread not like a wildfire, but like the slow, inexorable thaw of a frozen river. Mr. Davies returned to his family not only with a sled laden with firewood and a pot of hot soup, but with a story that was difficult to believe, yet impossible to dismiss. He told Mr. Abram, his voice filled with a newfound humility, of the quiet, draft-free warmth, the incredible efficiency of the small stove, the simple, devastating logic of the design. Abram, his own home still bleeding heat from every corner, listened in stony silence. The evidence was irrefutable, embodied in the survival of his neighbor's family. As the worst of the winter finally began to break its hold on the valley, a slow procession of visitors made their way to the Octagon cabin. They came not to mock, but to understand. Owen, the young carpenter, was the first. He came with a notebook and a piece of charcoal, asking quiet, respectful questions about the joinery, the pitch of the roof, the way she had braced the walls. Annalise answered him patiently, sharing the principles her husband had taught her. She explained how the increased surface area of the exterior walls actually helped insulate the interior, and how the shape minimized heat loss. Others followed. Men who had shouted jokes now stood at her door, hats in hand, asking to see for themselves. They stepped inside and fell silent, struck by the same profound sense of peace and shelter that had overwhelmed Mr. Davies. They felt the even warmth, saw the small, slow-burning fire, and understood. The cabin became a classroom, Annalise an unlikely teacher. Her quiet confidence, once mistaken for arrogance, was now seen for what it was, the quiet certainty of knowledge. The laughter of the previous summer was a distant, shameful memory. In its place grew a grudging, then a genuine, respect. Mr. Abram was the last to visit. He did not ask to come inside. He simply stood by her woodpile, now replenished, and looked from it to the house. "We built for speed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You built for winter." It was both an apology and a confession. Annalise simply nodded. There was nothing more that needed to be said. The winter had said it all. Years passed. The settlement of Providence did not fail. It endured, and it grew, shaped by the hard lessons of that first brutal winter. The valley, once a scattered collection of identical wooden boxes, began to show a new architectural language. The next spring, Owen, the young carpenter, was commissioned to build a new home for a family arriving from the east. He did not build a square. He built an octagon, incorporating the principles he had learned from Annalise, adding his own small refinements. It was the first of many. Not every new home was eight-sided, but the ideas behind it began to permeate the local building style. New cabins were built with angled corners to deflect the wind, with more complex roof systems to bear the weight of the snow, with a deeper understanding of insulation and thermal dynamics. The frantic haste of the first year was replaced by a more patient, thoughtful approach to construction. Annalise became a revered figure in the community, the quiet matriarch of the town she had helped save through her steadfast conviction. Her home was a landmark, a constant reminder of the wisdom of looking at a problem from a different angle. She never boasted, never reminded anyone of their earlier mockery. She didn't have to. The homes that now stood in the valley were a living testament to her vindication. She lived a long and peaceful life in her warm, quiet house, her loyal dog's descendants always at her side. Travelers passing through would often remark on the unusual number of eight-sided buildings in the town of Providence, assuming it was some strange local tradition. The older residents would simply smile and tell them the story of the widow and her strange cabin, the one that had been built with laughter and doubt, but which had ultimately taught them all how to survive. The story became a legend, a foundational myth of their community, a tale of how true strength is found not in conforming to the old ways, but in having the courage to build a better one.